In this second part of this module, we're going to be looking at a topic that's very closely related to what we were covering in the first module. In particular, we're going to be looking at the overarching concept of sensation and perceptual change that we undergo throughout our lifespan. Now, before we get into the specific areas of sensation and perception that we're going to focus on, I think it's probably best to just give some definitions of two things that people oftentimes, when they're not taking psychology courses, kind of intermingle and assume that they're the exact same thing. Technically, there are some differences, though, and kind of understanding development is really critical on, I guess it's critical to understand these differences to understand some of the developmental concepts we're going to be talking about. So when we're talking about sensation in a psychology course, we're talking about the process of actually converting the energies in our environment into some type of neural signal that our brain can eventually make sense of. This means we need lots of different structures and kind of irregular activities of neurons to be able to transfer massive amounts of information coming in from a whole variety of different sources into something that our brain can eventually process. The actual interpretation of that information, not necessarily the situation surrounding it, but just making sense of the signals coming to the brain from all of our different what we call sensory organs, is what perception is all about. And understanding that subtle difference between perception of a stimulus and perception of an environment surrounding a stimulus is another critical thing that we want to understand before going into the material today. But before we can get to that perceptual stuff, talk about how our mind is able to perceive, say, things like color or temperature or things along that line, we first want to talk about sensation, how the different structures and parts of our body are actually capable of converting those energies in the environment into something our brain can eventually process. Now, when discussing this conversion of energies into something that's neurological, we can go a lot of different routes. In fact, many people are encouraged when they take undergraduate programs to take a number of classes, including a sensation and perception class. And that's because to really understand these concepts, we have a lot of different senses to actually tackle. The one we typically cover in classes like this and intro classes is the sensation process of vision. And we will, just like usual in most developmental classes, focus a lot of attention on that particular topic, primarily because we know a lot about it, but also because it does really relate to this concept of development. And we have a little bit clearer idea of how vision is actually developing as we transition from infancy into adulthood and then from adulthood into the latter portions of our life. There's also something to be said for with hearing. It's not necessarily something that's universally covered in intro classes, but for a course like this, discussing hearing is really important because it's a very unique sense, both what's happening in utero and afterwards. We've already briefly touched up on how hearing seems to be present at birth, but we'll, in this class, really look at why hearing is present at birth and what specific structures are required for this to be possible. The other types of senses are a little bit tougher to tackle. Now, technically, we sort of already touched on, well, touch. We looked at the kind of tactile touch experiences that we have and how that often eventually involves that coordination between not only our sensory systems, but our motor systems. But if we really want to break down touch in, say, a sensory and perception class, there's multiple types of touch that are out there. We really just looked at the basic somatosensation experiences. There's also things like proprioception, which is our sense of touch with respect to kind of our body and its place in the environment. Gravity plays a role in this, the kind of orientation of different body parts with respect to others plays a role in it. And there's actually a lot of different structures that are critical in that particular experience that we take for granted, but it's really critical in our ability to function on a day-to-day basis. There's also something called interoception, which is all about kind of us being able to feel pains and aches and things that are happening within the body. Another thing that we didn't necessarily get to in our last class, and we don't really have time to cover in this one, but if you do end up taking a sensation and perception class, just know that that's another thing that we're going to explore. Same thing can be said for taste and smell or olfaction. Usually, when we look at our gustatory experiences or olfactory experiences, we spend a lot of time talking about the structures in the nose and in the mouth that are able to convert molecules into some type of neural signal. But trying to tackle it in a developmental psych class is kind of challenging, partially because we're still unclear as to how these things develop, when they form, what's causing them to form. And it's just a lot more iffy and complex than vision and hearing. So in this class, we are going to kind of turn our attention primarily to the topics of vision and hearing when trying to understand how sensory development occurs. And as I mentioned before, when we talk about sensory development, what we first have to do is focus on the structures that allow sensation and perception to occur. We're talking about how sensation of visual information occurs. What we're really talking about is the activation of cells in the very back of our eyes. And these cells are located in a structure or a place, I guess, within the eyes called the retina. And what these cells do is find ways to convert electromagnetic energies into some type of neurological signal. Now, on these particular structures of the eye, there's other things that are really critical for us to be able to process everything that's going on. We not only have the cells in the back of our retina, but we have a specific structure within that retina called the fovea, where we have large concentrations of cells converting electromagnetic energy into some type of neurological signal called cones. These are really critical for color perception. If we want to focus on things and be able to see things clearly, well, that light has to pass through a lot of different things, and it has to be adjusted in ways that allow us to focus on something regardless of what distance it is from our face. The thing that really helps with that is another structure that's actually just behind the front of our eyes, behind the black dot in the center of everybody's eyes called the pupil, which is actually just a hole. And this structure behind it is called a lens. The lens is constantly bending, allowing the refraction of light to change just in tiny little bits. So every time we look at something from different distances, we get as clear of a picture as possible. For those of you that have some clarity issues, know once you get into adulthood, those clarity issues really are not often a result of the lens. They're more a byproduct of the curvature of your eyes or other things that are happening within your eyes that are kind of causing the image to never be perfectly clear when things get at certain distances. The lens is usually doing its very best with what it can do. And this particular structure tends to get overlooked because we don't notice how active it is because everything tends to be pretty clear. But it's something that's constantly working to give us the most from the environment that's present to us. Now we're talking about, again, the kind of conversion of electromagnetic energy into some type of neurological signal. It's those rods and cones that are critical. But how do these structures, the rods and cones and the lens, relate to development? What we see is at birth, even though a lot of the structures within our eye are there, you essentially have the cells waiting and ready to go. You have the lens sort of there and built. There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of the fine tuning of our visual skills. And most people believe that there's a real logical reason for why there's probably is still a need for fine tuning once we're born. In the utero, we're not necessarily exposed to a lot of visual information. If anything, we see dim light occasionally because it's very bright in the environment and we're near the surface, near the skin, but most scientists argue that it's completely black, pitch black, while we're inside our mother's uterus. Therefore, it's really difficult for us to really develop a lot of the fine-tuned visual skills, even if everything is intact. So when we're born, our what's called visual acuity, ability to see things clearly, especially at distances, is really crummy. In fact, at birth, when trying to measure the visual acuity of children, what most researchers estimate is we probably have something like 20/240 vision at birth. What that means is for a young child, a newborn infant, what they can see at 20 feet is about the equivalence of what we can see in terms of clarity at around 240 feet, we being people with typical 20/20 vision. If we advance a little bit down the line, what we see is that the lens does work very hard to fine tune things within the first couple months of development. In fact, Most children by about 6 months have roughly 20/40 vision, and by the time they get to a year, vision is about as good as it's going to get. This is when you can start to talk about individual differences in the ability to see things clearly. It's tough to intervene at around 1 year because the eye is still technically developing, so things can potentially change. But usually visual acuity starts to really resemble what we're expecting to see in adulthood by about a year of age. And as that's developing, we're also developing something called color vision, the ability to actually identify the signals coming from the eyes that are going to the brain. That's really difficult for researchers to determine if the inability to detect colors is a byproduct of the cones not working well, or just the brain not knowing what to do with the signals, the information coming from the cones that are hitting the brain. But whatever it is, numerous studies that have looked at the children's sensitivity to colors and ability to kind of differentiate between colors suggest that what most newborns are able to do is maybe see things on sort of a gray scale, but it's not until about 4 to 8 weeks that children can actually differentiate between colors. And even then, the lack of a vocabulary linked to colors makes color differentiation that we kind of take for granted as adults very challenging. And it's not actually until about 3 or 4 months that children start to show preferences for specific colors. They might be drawn to something like the color of their bedroom, the color of their specific blanket. And it really highlights how long it takes for either the cones to work effectively or the brain to process what the cones are sending to it before that there really is an understanding of this thing we take for granted now as adults called color. What I also find kind of interesting with this is that there's many newborns whose parents insist that they have to wrap their child in a specific blanket color, even though there's really no reason to do that because these children can't actually detect the colors. So if you're worried about making sure that your female daughter is extremely feminine or your masculine child is extremely masculine, so you wrap them in pink or blue, know that that's kind of not really necessary. That the ability to see colors just isn't there for these kids. We could talk about how effication might play a role here, where if you're wrapping a child in blue, they might be treated differently than if they're wrapped in pink. But in terms of the children themselves, they can't perceive that color. I guess it's also kind of interesting to have another side here and let you know that the pink and blue thing is relatively new. A couple hundred years ago, there was no differentiation of colors between sexes. In fact, for a while, pink was typically associated with boys. It was a masculine color. So the kind of stereotypes and things we associate with it are all kind of screwed up when we think about it. But it again just brings us back to this really interesting fact that color vision is not something that develops for quite some time, usually about 3 to 4 months, and we're not really good at color differentiation until about, much like visual acuity, about a year of age. Another thing that kids are trying to kind of understand during the first couple months of age is something called perceptual constancy. This is where we transition from just having a way to convert signals in the environment to something that the brain can process to having the brain be able to break down the complex information that's coming to it. Perceptual constancy deals with our ability to kind of see things as consistent despite the fact that the images hitting our eyes are oftentimes changing. That means that if we say look at a door that's completely closed, slightly ajar, or open, we don't think of that door as changing. As adults, we kind of take this for granted, but for kids who are just processing visual information, there is a learning curve that has to take place. And in fact, it's not until about 3 months where children really start to seem to display a general sense of perceptual constancy. They don't get freaked out when, say, their parents are in different lights or they see their parents at slightly different angles. It's not until, though, around early adolescence that we truly have the ability to master this concept of perceptual constancy, to be able to kind of take into account ambient light, all these other things in the environment that are constantly shifting some of the things that we encounter. Now, it's very important to note that this is a shifting thing. So it's not like kids who are 12, 13 years of age, suddenly have this magical day when they realize perceptual constancy works for everything like sizes and shades and colors. It's just that they're getting better and better at it and able to kind of more effectively recognize perceptual constancy up to about the age of adolescence. Something closely related to this idea of perceptual constancy is the idea of something called depth perception, the ability to kind of estimate how far away something is from somebody. Depth perception requires the incorporation of actually a number of different elements of vision that we oftentimes take for granted. Not only do we need to be able to process how much the lens is bending for us to see things, but we have a whole slew of other depth perception cues that we use to get a better estimate of distance of things. There's one particular differentiation that many people make when talking about depth perception called the difference between monocular cues and binocular cues. Monocular cues are kind of calculations we use that we could do with just one eye. A great example of this is something called juxtaposition, when one thing is in front of another. So we can determine which thing's closest by how one is blocking the other one. Another thing that we often talk about in terms of these monocular cues for long distances are things like vanishing points or the amount of kind of disparity that's kind of being picked up in the environment. All of these things really give us a good hint as to how far something is, but just using all of the information that we've learned about in our past. The other types of cues, which are called binocular cues, rely on, as the name kind of implies, two different eyes. The classic binocular cue is something called retinal disparity, where we actually learned to calculate out the marginally slightly different images that both eyes are getting, or I guess sending to the brain, in order to determine distance of things. In essence, the closer something is to you, the more kind of separate or the slightly more different the images are that are hitting our two eyes. The further something is, obviously, the kind of more similar overlapped that image is between our two eyes. And in fact, there's lots of things that have taken advantage of this particular cue because we do rely on it a lot. Have you ever been to a 3D movie where you put on those glasses that end up sending two different images to your eyes to give you this perception of depth? You can understand and appreciate how much we do rely on binocular cues to estimate distance. Now, for young kids, it's probably important to note that this binocular cue does not work very well. Not only is it tough to process the dual images coming to the brain, but kids don't often rely on that binocular cue very much at birth. So it's not until around 2 to 4 months that kids display some sense of depth, but it's not for quite some time before guys people are able to, sorry about that, really understand distance based on this particular calculation. Now, it's important to note when we talk about color vision that even though there are some things that we need to learn, by around 1 or 2, we are pretty darn good with vision. Our visual abilities are pretty intact. Really, it's just more about fine tuning that happens all the way into adulthood. One of the big challenges that kids often have at young ages is to be able to detect color boundaries in a clear way and really see fine lines. This is also paired by the fact that our lenses, even though they're pretty darn good by 2 or 3, aren't quite flexible enough to kind of focus on information that's extremely up close. This is also because our eyes can't move quite as much when we're just 3 or 4 years old. So when we get to around 4 or 5, the ability to kind of see fine lines better and focus on things up closer tends to be associated with one of the important things that happens for most kids at this age, in particular the ability to read. It's not that kids can't read at younger ages, but it requires a lot more work to be able to focus on something, not just mentally, but visually focus on that thing. And to be able to kind of distinguish between all the lines that go in different directions. Essentially a lot to learn, and vision is a big issue when it comes to the ability to read at a young age. Once you get past that point, What we tend to see is our vision starts to really level off, not just for a few years, but actually numerous decades. It's not until our very latter years of life when our eyes start to kind of not necessarily deteriorate, but become more rigid, that we start to see visual impairments occur. Usually, when we're talking about visual impairments, though, it's a very slow, gradual decline near the end of life. Yes, our visual acuity, our ability to focus on objects starts to get a little bit worse when we get older, especially if we're working our eyes a little bit more. One of the things that all parents worry about nowadays is how often kids are staring at their cell phones and the thought that they might all need glasses in their 30s or 40s. I know that that's probably not going to come to fruition, but yes, your ability to see things from up close starts to get a little bit worse as you get older, and same thing with things from far. But what also happens is our ability to decipher colors starts to get a little bit off. This is potentially a byproduct of that neural noise that we talked about earlier. It means when there's lots of glare, it tends to make it very difficult for us when we're in our 60s and 70s to see things clearly. Also, when it's darker out, it's harder for us to see things in our latter years, and our color vision does start to decline, where we start to kind of struggle to differentiate between certain types of colors linked to the different responses of different cones. Our depth perception also drops a little bit, but this is primarily just due to that inability for the eyes to focus on things quite as clearly as it could before. And what that means is that our vision is, to an extent, impaired, and importantly, impaired at particular times of the day. When the sun is extremely bright or it's extremely dark out, vision is much more challenging for people who are usually in their 60s, 70s, and beyond. And this is something that's brought up a very hot topic of debate in the United States. How to kind of handle this with something that does require a lot of visual capabilities, in particular the ability to drive. There are many individuals in the scientific community that have argued that the vision of elderly individuals is extremely impaired at specific times. Maybe it's not appropriate to take, say, the driver's licenses away from these individuals, but it maybe is appropriate to prevent them from driving at specific times where their visual abilities would be extremely impaired, or at least to come and test them on a regular basis to see when they would be suited to drive, and kind of limit their driving times to those periods. Now, other individuals, especially in the United States, where we are very focused on our freedoms, have argued that this is not acceptable, that we should let people determine for themselves when they're safe to drive and when they're not. And we shouldn't be taking away something that somebody's had for their entire lives just because there's the possibility that their vision is becoming slightly more impaired. It's really tough to kind of have a definitive stance on this unless you're somebody that's really rigid on one side of the line. But I want us to just at least recognize that there is some science looking at visual impairments that can be incorporated into that discussion. The same thing can be said for some of the motor skill issues that we talked about before, where our motor skills are still intact usually when we get into our 60s and 70s, but the response rate, how long it takes us for us to engage in those motor skills, can be slightly hindered. I'm not talking minutes, but seconds or even fractions of a second can mean everything when you're, say, behind the wheel of a car. And how we adjust accordingly is definitely open for debate. The other structure that I want to focus on, as I mentioned before, is not just vision, but how hearing also adjusts throughout our life. And it's important to note again that, oddly enough, with hearing, pretty much everything we need for hearing is intact at birth. We're talking about the critical elements to hearing. We not only have that wonderful hearing component that we all see called the ear that funnels the information in through this nice expansive thing that eventually leads to this flesh-like structure called the eardrum, but then we also have three bones within that area that are capable of actually kind of how do I say it, amplifying the message that the eardrum is actually catching. There's lots of names that you've probably heard of with those three bones. One of my favorite is the stirrup, the anvil, and the, what is the other one? Shoot, I'm blanking on it right now. Uh, doesn't really matter. These particular structures, the stapes, the incus, and the malleus, are really big components to our ability to kind of process sounds a little bit more clearly. And they're well formed within birth. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about how those bones could potentially result in some problems in latter years of life when our hearing does start to kind of dwindle a little bit. But at birth, those things are well formed, they're nice and flexible, and the structure that's linked up to them, the structure called the cochlea, which has these strands on it that contain these hair follicles that actually bend and start the process of actually hearing, that they're what we call a sensory organ. These structures are all intact, and not only that, but the signals going to the brain seem to be capable of being processed not only at birth, but a few months before we're even born. Now, when I say hearing is intact, it's important to note that it doesn't mean that we're just able to hear things. What we see in a variety of different hearing tests is that everything we tie to hearing is already there at birth. We tend to be able to differentiate between different frequencies. We tend to be able to differentiate to different volumes. We tend to be able to locate things based on the speed at which information is hitting one ear versus the other. We also have the ability to differentiate between timbre and cadence so that many newborn infants can already recognize not only their mother's voice, but any voice that they've heard a lot while in utero and kind of show that they have some familiarity with those things. In fact, varying degrees of familiarity with those voices before they're born. This also means that songs or stories that newborn infants might have heard in utero can actually activate the brain in different ways than other stories or other songs that these kids have not heard. It really highlights how when we're talking about hearing, it's not just that the programming is ready to go, it's that the programming has been working before birth. In fact, there's not really a lot of fine tuning that needs to be done after assessing hearing. We don't usually talk about the growth in hearing. It's there, it's intact. Instead, what we tend to talk about is the decline of hearing. And when we look at the decline of hearing, for most of us, it's really a gradual process that happens much later in life. Now, it's important to note here that there are exceptions to this. So, for those of you that are rocking out at concerts or working with heavy construction equipment and not wearing earplugs, your hearing can deteriorate very quickly. You can lose the ability to detect ranges of volume, and your sensitivity, what's called your auditory threshold for being able to hear things, can really go up to where something has to be much, much louder for you even to hear it. This is extremely problematic because typically when your auditory threshold goes up, the volume that you have to hear things at before you can hear them does change, but your threshold for pain does not when your hearing goes bad. That means you oftentimes have a very small range where you can hear things versus when it just seems too loud and kind of overloads your system. But for the majority of the population who doesn't have that overabundance of sound and does damage to their ears or their structures within the ear that causes some type of kind of prolonged damage that lasts for the lifetime, the thing that causes deterioration of hearing over time is this process called ossification, where those bones within the ear that I talked about before, the stapes, the incus, and the malleus, starts to become more rigid. And what that does is it prevents them from really amplifying the sound coming from the eardrum and hitting the opening of the cochlea. And this means that essentially you need more stimulation to be able to hear things. But what's odd is that it's not universal in terms of which areas you need more stimulation. For most of us, when we hear things during that are kind of at voice range, usually when we're talking about this, it's frequencies that are somewhere around 1,000 hertz. We tend to hear those things fairly clearly throughout our entire life. But the really high-pitched sounds, the ones that are coming at a much higher frequency, and the low-pitched sounds, the mums, the low ones, those ones tends to be ones that our ears start to ossify that are tougher to detect. And essentially, the auditory threshold picks up on those. Again, the threshold for pain doesn't often change, so being able to detect those sounds when we get older becomes much harder. If we're looking for real world applications of this, it means when somebody talks with a lot of bass, or you've got children and you're around an elderly person, that elderly person is going to really struggle to hear those voices of the kids, to process all the sounds when they get at the really high or the very low pitches. And it's not that they're intentionally doing it, it's really a byproduct of the ever changing ear that starts to really pick up in our 70s and 80s. But beyond that, our hearing is pretty darn amazing. In fact, it's one of the more surprising things that researchers have looked at because of how intact it is at birth and how long it persists throughout the entirety of our life. As I mentioned, there's probably a lot of other stuff that we'd like to cover in a class like this. I encourage you all to take a sensation and perception class so you can learn more about smell and taste. But for a lifespan development class, it's really tough to cover these. The book does tackle it to an extent, and that's great. But just know there's a lot more debate about when these things are formed, how they form, what we're capable of doing at different ages. And we don't have that lack of certainty when it comes to vision and hearing. Also, remember, even though we covered touch in the last class, there's a lot more to it than what we discussed. There's a lot of different components to touch, and studying it, especially in infants, is extremely challenging when we can't see the motor responses that we're typically looking for when it comes to touch to indicate that different senses are actually being picked up on. So there's more out there that we just don't have time for covering in this video, and I encourage you to read about it, but there's even more out there than that that really can add to your understanding of it. So if you can, please do take a sensation and perception class that looks at these things even more closely, because you'll find some really amazing things relating to these different senses. Going to be covering those things. It's going to mark the end of this particular lecture. And it's also going to mark the end of our physical development section. We've been spending a lot of time talking about how the physical body changes and how some of the related components of the mind, like the nervous system, changed to kind of allow us to do all the physical things that we're capable of doing. We haven't spent a lot of time talking much about the mental. Yes, we've talked a little bit about a perception, and we've talked a little bit about kind of the coordination between the brain and the body, but the mind has been pretty much left out of this discussion so far. We're going to make up for that when we get into our next section after the next big thing that's coming up, when we start talking about cognitive development. So now's a good time to review if you need, get caught up, and hopefully you'll be ready to go for all the things that are upcoming, and you'll be ready to understand the cognitive stuff that we'll be getting to very soon. And for now, take care, and I hopefully see you very soon.